What's up, everybody? Today's video is a little bit different. You're probably looking at this setup wondering, what is this about? I thought this was an audio channel. Why does he have blenders and not amplifiers? That's a great question. The thing is, channel's gonna work a little differently now. I'm still gonna talk a lot about audio things here and there, but I'm also just gonna talk about things I feel like talking about and opportunities I stumble across that I feel I can contribute to. I actually have a background as both a Blendtec and a Vitamix demonstrator, and so I know a lot about high-end kitchenware products like that, health food products, boutique stuff of a different category, much like hi-fi is. Really anything high-end is something I'm attracted to, and that includes great kitchenwares, particularly in the fields of blending and juicing, because I like that health foods kind of stuff. No, I'm not a vegetarian. No, I'm not a vegan. In fact, I'm supposed to be on keto eat right now, eating mostly meat. But even in the realms of high-end blending, there are some really useful things that you can do with these machines to support all kinds of diets. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that today. Today's feature is a shootout between the gold standard in high-end blending, which is Vitamix, versus a new contender that's got a completely revolutionary, you might even say radical design from Tribest, a company best known for high-end twin gear juicers like the Green Star. Vitamix has about a 100-year history, Tribest a little over 30 if I recall. Tribest is based out of California and does a lot of manufacturing in South Korea, who's known for making very good kitchenware such as juicers. Vitamix is based right outside of Cleveland and is US made, which is fantastic. Both of these are marketed as high-end machines, and I can tell you my initial impressions of both of them, particularly having been a Vitamix demonstrator and owner for years, are that those claims are true. These are high-end machines. But Tribest comes to the table offering a product that is a little different. One thing about the Vitamix, to extract max performance out of it, you need to use this tool known as a tamper to push down and help process ingredients as they blend. You do not need this all the time, but particularly with dense blends like nut butters, frozen ingredients, or nice cream made out of frozen bananas or the like, as we like to call it, you're definitely going to need that. Tribest claims to have solved this tamper problem with a jar that has an inner and outer jar where one rotates counter to the blade, pushing the ingredients opposite the blade force and helping everything process. We're going to see how well that works, how much it increases convenience, and if with or without tamper, this product can stand up to the gold standard of results produced in a product like the Vitamix. Full disclosure, Tribest has provided me the backspin free of charge. Thank you, Tribest. However, I have promised them, and now to you, that this will be an objective shootout. I am not going to put the backspin in a favorable light automatically. We're going to look at the ins and outs of this complete setup and experience. We're going to test various blends, smoothies, frozen desserts, and then we'll talk about things like power, warranties, available accessories. Vitamix has a massive range of accessories now. There is one additional accessory out for the backspin. We'll see if they follow up with more. But all of those things deserve to be considered when you're going to purchase into a high-end and frankly not cheap ecosystem. Any high-end blender that's asking you to buy into an ecosystem that can start at about $300, $400, even $500 needs to do a lot more than just be a glorified smoothie maker or simple mixer. They need to perform, they need to achieve excellent results, and they need to be able to do things like smoothies, frozen desserts, hot soups, some stuff that crosses over with a food processor, whipping, dry ingredients processing and milling, and the list goes on. So we're going to do a lot of that today. And to really give the backspin the gauntlet, because that is the goal here, can it stand up to a legacy established by a brand like Vitamix, doing the things that this product is known to do? So I'm going to hit the backspin with my old Vitamix demonstrator recipes. Yeah, I am going to ever so slightly bias in favor of the Vitamix by using mostly their recipes, because it is this machine that has come up on the block claiming to be the Kingslayer. So let's see if it can do it playing by the same rules. All right, before we get into doing some blending and demonstrating some recipes and all the fun parts, let's talk a little bit about the specs of this machine and of this one, and just some of the things that you're going to want to know about them. Okay, things that they have in common. Warranty. 10-year warranty on the Tribest Backspin. 10-year warranty on the Vitamix. And for reference, this is a Vitamix Ascent A3500. This is the outgoing flagship. It has since been replaced by the Ascent X5. However, there is little difference. The X5 has an updated design. It has more smart features and more blending programs. This has 5, that one has 10. However, at the end of the day, end result performance, provided you're using the machine correctly, is the same. So the A3500 is still perfectly relevant. Power. The Backspin is a 900 watt machine. The Vitamix A3500 is a 1500 watt machine, as are most Vitamix products, save for the older models that used to have the taller jar. They're often referred to as the classic. Most of those were about 1400 watts. This one's about 1500 or 2.2 horsepower. The Backspin at 900 watts is just a little over 1 horsepower. We're going to see if that power discrepancy makes for a real appreciable difference. Hopefully for the Backspin, it won't, but we're going to find out. The Backspin, though, does have an ace up its sleeve, and that is the contra-rotating jar. The blade spins one direction, the jar spins the other. That counter force creates a higher collision speed by having the contents of the jar move one way while the blade does the other. So we'll see if that makes up for the power discrepancy, whereas the Vitamix is seeing that 2.2 horsepower all in one direction at the blade tips. Blade speed is another consideration. On the A3500 featuring the 64-ounce jar, which has the larger 4-inch blade, this is going to produce about a 270 mile an hour blade speed when you consider that this is, depending on who you ask, because no one seemed to really been able to pin it down, somewhere between 22,000 to 25,000 RPMs. That at a 4-inch blade is about 270 mile an hour blade speed. Now for the Backspin, the blade is a little bit more asymmetrical than that of the Vitamix, but if I take what seems to be the longest end to end from one blade tip to the opposite, I get about 4.75 or 4 3/4 inches. 4 3/4 inches at 15,000 RPM is a blade speed of about 212 miles an hour at the tips. So it's a little bit less than the Vitamix, seemingly so off the bat. However, because of that contra-rotating jar, pushing the ingredients at a certain speed in a different opposite direction, we're going to get an additive effect because of that collision, provided it works out as well as they claim it does. I don't know the RPM of the counter-rotating jar. That doesn't seem to be listed, but we can assume we're getting some additive force there. All right, now I'm going to talk about initial impressions of build quality. Right off the bat, I'm going to give initial material felt in my fingertips and observed build quality to the Vitamix. Now, I'm not dumping on the Backspin too hard here. I'm not saying that this is poorly made. It is decently made. This is perfectly acceptable plastic materials. The buttons feel decent. The knob works just fine. But this is a shootout. We're going to get into the nitty-gritty here. The Vitamix just feels like a hawking beast the second that you pick it up. It feels like a tank. It feels like you could throw it across the room and it wouldn't break. Speaking of throwing things, when I was a Vitamix demonstrator, I would just drop the jar on the hard concrete floor of the Costco I usually demonstrated in and let people see this thing is crazy durable. This is made out of Triton, which is a BPA-free copolyester that you can kind of imagine is like polycarbonate minus bisphenol A and other plastic nasties we don't want getting into our body. Triton, in my opinion, is a bit of a wonder material, at least in the world of kitchenwares. Now for the Backspin, I don't know the name of the material that they're using in the jar. However, they do tell us that it is BPA free, so that's good. I suspect that it's Triton or something similar because it does feel a lot like the Vitamix jar, just maybe a little bit of a thinner wall. However, it is still a decent build here, and you can also see how that's got the 2 stages in there, which I'm going to pop open for a second. You take out one lid, and then you take out a second lid, and you can see the 2-stage jar design there with that counter-rotating interior. And that pretty big blade, which in the Backspin is a removable magnetic blade, which I do like because it makes it easier to spatula things out of the jar when you're done. But there's also a downside to removable blades, and we'll get to that in a second. On the Vitamix jar here, your lid just pops off like so. It lifts right off. There's a shot of your blade inside your Vitamix jar. Both these blades are stainless. Both these blades use a real solid stainless steel gearing system, not some plastic paddle nonsense. So good on both of them for that. Still, I'm going to give initial build quality impressions to the Vitamix, but I'm not saying that the Backspin is far behind. This thing, especially the A3500 though, also comes with a base with an outer shell of stainless. And on top of that, should you ever actually bog down these machines to the point of causing a thermal threat to the motor, both these motors have thermal cutouts in them. A lot of cheap blenders have the plastic paddles actually designed to shred themselves upon encountering too much resistance. You then have to replace it if parts are even available. They're often not. Or you're buying a new blender. Such is often the case with products that are cheap and designed to be pretty much disposable or fall into that category of planned obsolescence here in this 21st century dystopian nightmare we live in of very few reliable, long-lasting products. I'm happy to say that the Vitamix for sure is one of those reliable, long-lasting products with a 100-year history and machines known to last in excess of 20 years. The Backspin is a new product for Tribest, however they have made nice blenders in the past, and they are a company with a history of making good products like the Green Star juicers that have also lasted for a very long time. So, while I don't have tangible evidence of how long you're going to get out of this machine, it's coming from a company with a good track record, so we're going to give it the benefit of the doubt here. As the rest of the evidence that we can initially view with our eyes here suggest good things. All right, let's talk a little bit about the ecosystem that each of these machines brings to the table, because the expanded range of uses beyond simple blending is often a reason that many people look at Vitamix because they have a lot more accessories. Right now, the Backspin's only available accessory is a vacuum tumbler. You blend up your drink, you pour it into a tumbler, you stick it in here and use the Backspin's integrated vacuum feature, which we will talk more about during the blending process, to seal that jar for longer term storage. Really cool extra little product, but it is just one. On the Vitamix, we have the 64-ounce jar, the 12-cup food processor attachment, which uses a gearing system to take this 2.2 horsepower and make a food processor blade run at basically the perfect speed. That comes with your flat blade, and then with some additional disc blades that you can put inside for dicing and chopping. There's also the 48-ounce size jars for smaller blends where you have a little bit less liquid content or total contents, and this thinner design helps with the blending process, and it's just smaller and sometimes a little bit more convenient. This 48-ounce jar, this is the traditional Triton model. They also make a completely stainless variant of this if you just want to avoid plastics entirely. And then there's the 48-ounce dry grains jar for milling your own wheat flour at home, or breaking rice down into rice flour, or almonds into almond meal, etc., etc., etc. Finally, these are pretty fun. You've got these 20-ounce jars with a lid that you can screw off and attach a blade to for personal size blending, where you just put this right on top of the machine, blend and go. There's also an 8-ounce variant for like doing little dipping sauce sizes of blends. Those are all really handy. Now, quick note about that. Apparently, these small blend sets are temporarily discontinued from Vitamix right now because of some perceived safety issue that I can promise you was nothing more than user error, knowing the design of that. So they're working on some rework of it, but whatever. All right, for this next portion of the video, I'm gonna push the camera in a little bit so we can get a closer look at these machines. I'm gonna show you some of the program functions on the Vitamix, how its basic operation works. Then I'm gonna show you the same on the Backspin. And finally, we'll get blending here. And pushing in, you're not gonna see my face as much. Tragic, I know, but you'll get a better detailed view of what we're trying to do. Okay, for our push-in view here, we're gonna start with the Vitamix, and I'm gonna show you how the controls on this machine works. Very straightforward and very simple. This is your speed knob for dialing in manual speeds. These are your presets for the 5 different programs that you find on the Ascent 3500. This one right here is smoothie, frozen dessert, hot soups, dips and spreads, and self-cleaning cycle. We'll talk a little bit more about the cleaning and just my recommendations for that too. But let's say we were going to do a smoothie. We simply tap that and then we'd hit the play button and that would start the process. It would start at speed 5.5. It runs for 50 seconds. You would see this timer count down. And after about, I think it's 10 seconds of blending, it kicks up basically to speed 10 and just processes at full speed for the rest of the cycle. Frozen desserts is not too different. It just runs a little bit longer because you need slightly more processing for that. Hot soups is a special cycle. You'll see 5 minutes, 45 seconds on there. That is for the 64-ounce container. This will actually change speeds and times based on the container that you're using because it can detect which one is on there and optimize for it, which is fantastic. Soups runs for so long because it uses the additional time to actually heat the soup via the friction of the blade. When you're spinning at 270 miles an hour over a course of nearly 6 minutes, this will have a heat rise of nearly 60 to 70 degrees. So if you start with room temperature produce in here, you can come out with piping hot soup of about 140 to 150 degrees. It's pretty incredible. Dips and spreads is pretty self-explanatory. Do that when you're making, like, say, a jelly base, a nut butter with the aid of the tamper, which you're certainly going to need for that. And then self-clean is pretty self-explanatory. You fill the jar halfway, you put a drop of dish soap in it, hit that button, let it go, rinse it out. Manual speeds work by using your knob. You'll see that this goes from 1 to 10, but notice 1 plus, and then 2, 2 plus, and then 3. So counting the pluses, which everyone has except for 10, there's actually 19 speed steps on this machine. So your level of fine control is pretty fantastic. At speed 1, the blade is just at the lower end of a couple hundred RPM. So doing a quick chop in here, like throwing a handful of grape or cherry tomatoes, some pre-diced onion and carrot, and just going pulse, pulse, pulse. You can make a salsa actually very easily, for example. This is all touchscreen other than the knob, which is an electronic digital knob, but has a nice bit of tactility to it. You can feel very softly each click with your fingers. Vitamix really does get the tactile experience down. In fact, one of my favorite Vitamix machines was the old Pro 750, previous generation of this. It didn't have touchscreen portions, but it had switches and levers that just felt so satisfying to click. If you know me, I like my clicky buttons. Okay, now I'll show you the backspin controls. We have auto low, auto high, standard auto function, pulse function, and vacuum. Vacuum simply tells it that you want it to suck all the air out of the container before you blend. We're going to talk about the benefit of that later. You can turn that on and off like so. This knob adjusts speed. However, one thing about the backspin that I've noticed, it does not seem to have a purely manual function, which I find surprising. I would have thought that by moving this knob, which adjusts well but has a bit of a crunchiness as you can tell, and by clicking it, which it can click, but it doesn't really do anything. Again, there doesn't seem to be a manual mode. But what you can do is hold pulse, start the machine up, and while holding that, you could adjust the knob speed. However, I do have a small criticism here. It always starts at max and you have to scale back. You do not get to set the speed you want ahead of time, making the pulse feature less useful on this machine right off the bat. And the fact that there's no pure manual is kind of a bummer. The auto settings work well. I'm going to show you how each of those work. In a nutshell, auto low is best for smoothies, things that can be processed quickly. It's about a 50-second runtime. Standard auto is a 1 minute 55-second runtime, and auto high is just shy of 5 minutes. You'd use that for something like soups. Though we'll see just how much of a heat rise this can achieve on soups and how well it deals with that since it has limited venting with the vacuum built in, whereas the Vitamix can vent a little bit better because it doesn't worry about a vacuum and has a vented top lid as it is. All right, time to get to the actual blending. So here comes the fun part. Recipe 1 is going to be one of my old favorites from the Vitamix Demonstrators book. This is going to be a whole orange, about an inch thick slice of pineapple straight through, half a banana, handful of spinach. That handful is about 1 cup exactly, just packed tight. And we might put a little squirt of agave in there, though that part is optional. So let's go ahead and load our jars and we'll get going. Okay, we're gonna load our Vitamix first. Your lid just easily pops off like so. Now there is a load order to these machines. You wanna do, if you have liquids, they go first. We're not gonna have any pure liquids in this one. And you load liquidy filled produce first. So orange, pineapple, full velada liquid, soft liquidy things go first. On top of that, things that are less liquidy but still soft go. Then you do your harder produce, then you do leafy produce, and then you do ice. That load order in almost any high-power blender minimizes the need for the tamper, okay? It's the easiest for the blender to process through. We're going to follow those recommendations for both machines, because why not? And then finally would be our spinach. And I'm gonna throw a handful of ice in here as well, about a cup's worth. And there is our cup of ice, just a little bit. You could do no ice, more ice, whatever you want. I do that just to cool it slightly, but I do not like smoothies that are more ice than they are anything else. I think that's kind of a joke, actually. Neither do I like making my smoothies way too cold, because they actually become less tasty. Taste tends to scale with temperature. I find the perfect smoothie temperature to be like wine temperature, for example. Now we're gonna load the backspin, which is a little bit more involved because of its unique design. We raise the top, and now there's two lids to get through. The outer lid for the outer jar, just peel that up. And then there's an inner lid you just grab like so and lift out. Now one thing about the backspin, I'm gonna pop this off real quick to show you. Because of the dual jar design, you do have a gap here. So keep that in mind when loading, that you try not to get anything in between the two jars where you don't want it to go. A little bit of a thought I had here, and Tribest, take this to heart if it means anything to you, maybe coming up with an insert like a ring that can be temporarily placed that has a funneling shape that you can set on top and help everyone funnel their ingredients to the right jar. That would also have a spout on it for pouring, because one thing about the backspin jar, there is no spout. It still pours okay being a round shape, but it's a little awkward at first. So it's one of the few compromises to make the counter rotating work. Anyway, let's get back to it. With this though, you would place your jar in like so and then rotate to lock. See that? And lock. With the Vitamix, it just sits, and that's all there is to it. So a couple things about the backspin that's a little unique there, but understandable to make the contra rotation work. So, soft things first: orange, banana, pineapple. Leafy things toward the top of that list, because if we had anything harder, that would go, and then we would do leaves. Got a couple more to throw in there, and then ice usually goes last. And there's our ice. One thing I may have forgotten to mention earlier about the backspin jar, this is a 60-ounce jar, by the way. That is a 64-ounce jar with options for 48 and some of the others that I showed you. The backspin is always going to be a 60 though. All right, let me get this out of the way. Take your inner lid, pop that in. Take your outer lid, line it up with this tab here, push that down. You'll hear some air come out because that makes a tight seal for the vacuum system. Put down your top, you'll hear it beep when it clicks into place. If it doesn't make any other sounds, it's good to go. So now we're ready to blend. All right, so before we start, I'm going to showcase the vacuum feature of the backspin. The backspin's two unique features it's bringing to the table here are the vacuum and the counter rotating jars. Why a vacuum? Well, when you spin at really high speed, you introduce a lot of air. When you swirl a lot of air into ingredients like produce, think especially in the case of something like apples or tomatoes, you can quickly oxidize that produce. You know, you take a bite of an apple, you let it sit for 10 minutes and it starts to turn brown. That's oxidation, because the juices in the apple are being exposed to the open air, which contains oxygen. Vacuum blending removes the air from the container and the oxygen along with it, duh. And in doing so, you can theoretically preserve the blended ingredients longer. Also, less air in the blend means you may get a few less burps when you drink your smoothie and it's got less air in it. Vitamix has in the past addressed the vacuum thing, as they have not released a vacuum feature for any of their products yet. They claim it doesn't matter. I disagree, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later because we will do an oxidation test. So with Tribest being one of the products that brings vacuum blending to the market, that's a big plus in my book. I really wish Vitamix would get on board with that, considering with this decent lid design they already have, making some kind of vacuum pump to go in the place of the center plug, I don't think that would be particularly difficult. Anywho, let's get going. So for vacuuming on the backspin, first, you're gonna hit the vacuum button like I showed you on the top panel earlier. Auto low is a 55-second mode that is gonna be most comparable to the smoothie load here on our Vitamix. So we're gonna set them both for that. What I'm gonna do is press auto low on the backspin. It's gonna go through the vacuum process, and once that nears the end, I'll start the Vitamix so that they can run mostly concurrently. I'm also gonna run a timer so that we can see just how long it takes to start and run the vacuum, so we can get a total blend time here if you're using that feature on the backspin. So again, vacuum, auto low, timer on. This also shows you with the ring up here, it starts to light up and make a full ring to show you the progress of the vacuum. We just crossed halfway at 20 seconds. And I will start these once that finishes. And that took 40 seconds. All right, the Vitamix didn't need its tamper this time around. Okay, that took 1 minute, 29 seconds, 0.55, 1 minute 30 total for the backspin with vacuum and auto low. All right, let's get into these. We'll get our Vitamix result first. And you can see that's nice and smooth. We got some air bubbles in there though. Let's get our backspin. Outer lid, inner lid, set that aside. Now the pour is a little awkward on this, like I was saying, but we make it work. And I can see there's less air in that, as we would expect from the vacuum. Vitamix result right here, backspin result right here. Now hopefully the camera's picking this up, but I think that it is. You see an immediate color difference. The extra air incorporated into the Vitamix makes it seem a tad lighter at the moment. The backspin, a little darker, and you can notice the presence of less bubbles in it. See that? All right, time for our taste test. Start with Vitamix, the old staple, just like I remember, of course. Smooth as silk, but I would say a little airy or light feeling. Backspin, even by taste, there is definitely less air in that, which is a plus. However, this is a little coarser than the Vitamix. While the backspin got the air out and did otherwise fine job processing, in terms of complete smoothness that I can perceive via taste, the Vitamix is still a little smoother than the backspin. I would consider this a passing result. This is still better than some cheapo blender by a light year. but Vitamix is still a little smoother. And that's kind of always been their thing, is that gold standard of fine, smooth blending. So they're going to take it on the Vitamix demonstrator green smoothie recipe, which, as we saw, was no problem for the Backspin to blend through. They both blended through it fine. The Vitamix didn't even need its tamper on this run. So we give a point to the Backspin because of the vacuum thing. But for just sheer blending performance, it is the Vitamix on this one. Now let's be a little more objective and do what's called a white plate test. I'll show you how that works. Okay, the white plate test is as simple as follows. Take a little bit from our Vitamix, spread it out on a white plate. Rinse off the spoon. Take a little from the Backspin. We spread it on our plate. All right, friends, what do we see? There's the Backspin. There's the Vitamix. Vitamix definitely has more trapped air. However, which one do you see more particles in, more texture? To my eye, the Vitamix is certainly finer blended than the Backspin, at least from this 50-55 second blend time. I'm thinking we'll give the Backspin another shot here with its longer auto cycle, which is nearly 2 minutes, and see if that helps it at all. But second for second, we can see that the Vitamix is breaking down finer than the Backspin. And now that a few minutes have passed, there's the Vitamix, there's the Backspin. You can see the Backspin is definitely still holding a richer color. So it certainly does demonstrate something about that vacuum feature being useful. We'll see if we can make up a little bit of that blend quality gap with a longer cycle, and we'll revisit this recipe again. All right, so now we're going to talk about cleaning. Cleaning the Vitamix in particular has always been really easy, and I'm going to show you that in a second. But we're going to just take a look at the damage, if you will, here. With the Vitamix, it's all one piece. This is going to be pretty easy. We had a spout, which was helpful. Backspin worked out just fine, but it is a little bit awkward without that spout, and I'll show you something else in just a second here. Looking into the Backspin jar, there's our damage, but also notice on the front there, where we had some leakage into the outer jar because of that gap. Now that's okay, we can clean that out, but this does get a little more complicated, wouldn't you say? Now I'm going to show you two things. Generally, what Vitamix recommends for cleaning is this. I'm going to go take this jar over to my sink back here, and I'm going to bring it back halfway full of water. Now what I'm going to do, a little drop of Dawn. And this is how we can run the self-cleaning function. And you put your lid on, hit the self-clean, and go. Once that's done, we're just going to go rinse our jar out. Okay. Pour out that, rinse, and that's all there is to it. Now, here's the truth about this, guys. I showed you that because that's what you're supposed to do. But right after a blend, before anything dries up and gets sticky, do you really think it would be that hard to come over to the sink and just rinse it out the way that it was? Dry out your jar and go about your day without really needing to worry about a so-called self-clean? No, I virtually never use that function, okay? I just take the jar right over to the sink, rinse it out as is from the get-go. I'll use a little soap if I have to, and 9 times out of 10, I don't. So about all of these newer Vitamix jars from the Ascent series onward, they're rated dishwasher safe. That's pretty easy. Okay, for cleaning the backspin, you can add 24 ounces of warm water, lock your jar back in, put your lids back on, much like we did with the Vitamix. Interestingly enough, the Backspin's manuals did not say anything about using soap at this stage, so I didn't. And then it says just use the pulse button. And there we go. Let's go rinse her out. All right. Now we just take her apart and get going. It says just rinse everything out gently. That's what we'll do. The backspin, your blade does come out. Now, in my opinion, this is both a plus and a minus. It is a plus because if we had a thick blend in there, we were trying to spatula out, that would get out of the way. But it's also a minus because it's another part that needs to come out that you gotta wash underneath. And the Vitamix blade is purposely dull, and it still achieves the incredible result that it does being so. The backspin blade is rather sharp. I would not want to run my finger across the edge of this, whereas on the Vitamix blade, just real quick, see this? Doesn't hurt me. Anywho, we got to separate the inner jar from the outer. I kind of just give it a shake to pop that out. Rinse this guy off. That should do for now. Rinse the inside of the inner jar out. Dump that. And then of course we would just dry it off with a hand towel from there. One thing about the backspin, when I was washing the Vitamix jar, you heard me mention that it was dishwasher safe. Unfortunately, the backspin is not dishwasher safe. All right, we're gonna put the backspin back together. We're gonna give it another shot at the green smoothie recipe by running it on auto as opposed to auto low. That's about an additional minute of blending time. We'll see how it does with a little bit more time. Because there have been instances, to be fair, where even on the Vitamix, I manually went another 20, 30 seconds or so to pulverize something just a little bit harder. So let's see if the backspin can benefit from that additional time. And before we do that, I'm just gonna give you one more lesson in how to reassemble this jar. Okay, bottom jar, inner jar. Slide that in. That gets into place. Take the blade. It's magnetic, which is great. Line that up, magnet pulls it down, boom. Inner lid goes like so. Outer lid, line up the tab, push it down, and that goes back on your base. Like so, you can see the unlock there. Slide that to the lock, lid down. One thing about the backspin is a little bit more complicated to put together. All right, we're gonna give the backspin another swing at the green smoothie recipe. And of the buttons on here, which are auto low, auto, and auto high, those all just vary the time, we're gonna use auto. Auto low is 55 seconds. Auto is about a minute longer than that, and auto high is nearly 5 minutes long. That one's gonna be used for more like soups. You'd never use a cycle that long for a smoothie because you'd risk heating it up. But auto at 1 minute 55 seconds with a portion of that being the pulsing chopping stage, I think that might be a more fair option for something that's got fibrous particles in it, like spinach. So let's give it a swing with that mode and see how it does. And we'll do another fineness and white plate test. Here we go. Definitely gets itself going just fine though. Okay, that was the first time around with the backspin. This one right here. Here's a backspin with the longer cycle. Let's see if this helped. Visually, backspin part 2 in the glass looks a little bit better. Let's see. Okay. Auto low, where I thought it was still a little rough. Auto setting. Longer blend time. Let's see. The second time is definitely smoother. That longer time really helped it. White plate test. Second time. First time. Oh, heck yeah. Look at that. The longer processing really helped. It's a night and day difference. I'm going to say the Vitamix might, and this is getting very close to margin of error, so let me admit that straight up. Vitamix might still slightly take this for texture, but this is so much closer that as a consumer, I wouldn't really care anymore. Like I said, I think we're near margin of error level now. That's awesome. So what we've learned on the backspin, use a longer cycle. The extra time is worth it, absolutely. Okay, the next recipe, this will be the one where the tamper is likely gonna need to come out for the Vitamix, and where the backspin is really going to gain some ground, I would imagine. This is a frozen recipe. Strawberry yogurt freeze. 1.5 cups each machine of really thick, full-fat yogurt. 1.5 pounds of strawberries, and then a tablespoon of agave nectar for a little added sweetness, because ice cream or frozen yogurt is supposed to be sweet. All right, I'm going to skip all the loading, just get this going, because I think you get that idea now. The way that we're going to do this is round 1 is going to be no help from the tamper on the Vitamix, and we're going to see how they fare. And then depending on the results of this, if the tamper has to come out, which I imagine it will, we'll take a good look at everything after this result, and then if the Vitamix needs to be tamped, we will use the tamper on the second run. I think this is a particularly great opportunity for the backspin to shine. So let's see how it does. And for these, we're going to be using, on the Vitamix, the frozen dessert option, and the original auto setting on the backspin, which is the 1 minute 55 second setting. There are some recipes where the backspin recommends using auto high for frozen ingredients, which is a 4-minute cycle, but I am curious to see how it does on the medium length cycle, which is simply named auto. That's the one that really did it on the smoothie recipe. So let's see how it fares here too. We're always going to use the vacuum feature on this because one of its 2 standout features. So once that gets close to finishing up and kicks in, we'll start the Vitamix too. All right, so there's the end of our blends. I'm thinking we didn't get a perfect result on either of these. We can particularly see that here on the Vitamix. But let's get inside the machines and see what we got. Okay, there's our Vitamix result. Certainly not processed all the way, though on the bottom there it did make a little progress, so we can see the beginnings of what's supposed to be our strawberry freeze forming. And for the backspin, we did not actually get the result I was hoping we would. However, it is more processed, and in the middle there we are seeing a mostly completed result of what has been blended. So now what we're going to do is we're going to pull the tamper out for the Vitamix, and we're going to put the backspin on auto high and let it go for those whole 4 minutes and see how both of these machines fare once they're given some help. Okay, same thing. We're going to let the vacuum re-engage on the backspin. Hit auto high, just let it start doing its thing. And I will go back to the frozen desserts option on the Vitamix, now using the tamper. And we'll kick the Vitamix in once the backspin starts blending. So part one was our less than ideal conditions test. Seeing if we could pull out a win for the backspin with no tamper. It certainly did better, absolutely, but not perfect. So now we're gonna give them each tamper for the Vitamix, which it is designed to use, and auto high for the backspin, which it recommends for these really thick frozen recipes anyway. There we go. All right, they're done. Let's see what our result looks like. Start with the backspin this time. Much better. That looks like it could pass for frozen yogurt and ice cream for sure. Vitamix. Fun fact I remember from being a demonstrator, you see that shape, call it the Vitamix star. When doing frozen blends, that is the shape that you look for. Generally, you do need the tamper, like we did, but that's what you want to see. And that also looks like it's going to pass for frozen yogurt or ice cream. Let's do a taste test. Dig out the backspin result first. Looks pretty good. Nope. I did find one chunk of strawberry in there so far, but I think I'll let that one slide as long as the rest isn't too bad. Now for Vitamix. All right, we'll try the backspin one first. Tasty just like I remember it. And that is a pretty good blend. I think I found a berry in here though. It was an unprocessed berry in there, but what did process is good. Look, I'm trying to make legit, fully frozen blends with a design that's tamper-free. There's no way around it. It's tough. So I'm not 100% satisfied with this result because we do have what seemed like 2 or 3 strawberry chunks left, but the rest is processed well. Yeah, it's still delicious. But let's try the Vitamix. Delicious also. But with the aid of the tamper, the Vitamix result is a little bit smoother tasting than the backspin. It's not huge. It's less of a delta than it was that first time with the smoothie before we ran the backspin longer. Okay, white plate test. That's the backspin. That's the Vitamix. Definitely closer than it was the first time in that smoothie result. And of course, when we did the longer cycle in that, you recall the backspin caught up some ground. The Vitamix, to my taste and to my eye here, is smoother than the backspin in this result, but the delta is much lower. Both tasted really good. But you can see in the backspin there are slightly larger pieces of strawberry than there are in the Vitamix. But that's probably somewhere within 10 to 20%. Both are really good. The backspin did produce an appreciable result without a tamper, so it succeeds in that, but it was not a perfect result. There were 3 unblended strawberries in that mix, but it's not too bad out of 1.5 pounds, and I did push the backspin a little past its limit. In the manual, it doesn't really recommend loading frozen ingredients too far past about 45 ounces. And I did load it to, I think, about 55. So I pushed it a little bit, and I did that on purpose. So it still managed to pull out a good result when pushed past the limit. All right, this is gonna be a fun one. We're going to make some homemade peanut butter. This is 1/2 pound of roasted salted peanuts and 1/2 pound of honey roasted peanuts, making for a great combination. Honey roasted peanut butter is delicious, but sometimes a little too sweet. So I find doing 1/2 and 1/2 is right in that Goldilocks zone of just right. I imagine this will favor the backspin a little bit because this is one of those thick blends that I can just about guarantee you is going to require a tamper on the Vitamix. But we'll do a round 1 with the recommended settings on the backspin, which is auto high, and with the spreads and dips setting on the Vitamix, no tamper. We'll see how that turns out, and then we'll come back for a round 2 with the tamper on the Vitamix. Let's get going. We don't really need the vacuum function for this. It's not as important for something like nut butter, so we're just gonna roll. Dips and spreads, auto high. Here we go. All right, let's see what we got here. Oh, heck yeah. Look at that. That's perfect peanut butter if I ever saw it. Yeah, this is the best result from the backspin so far. And I don't even have to take the jar off the Vitamix, which I will, but you can already see. No contest whatsoever. Of course, we'll see how using the tamper fares, but the backspin, when it comes to nut butters, really delivered on the whole hands-free promise. So that's a big win for the backspin right here. But we'll be fair and do round 2 with a tamper. All right, no need to blend anymore on the backspin because that was a literally perfect result. Just fantastic. So now we're going to do the Vitamix round 2. We are going to use the tamper. We're going to use dips and spreads again. Here we go. And you kind of just push in on the corners to keep it mixed. Okay. Now, of course, the backspin did go for 4 minutes. That was 45 seconds on the Vitamix. This is a good result for a chunkier peanut butter. Like, I'm still happy with that. But we're going to need to use more time on the Vitamix to get it smoother. However, that's still fair and in bounds if you ask me, because the backspin's recommended setting for nut butters was 4 minutes. This is also the Vitamix's recommended setting for spreads and butters, but it's a little bit more of a universal setting than just nut butters. Like, you would also use this to make a mostly liquidy spread that you might not even need the tamper for. So we are going to acknowledge that, but we're going to cut it a little bit of slack just in recognizing total time making the biggest difference here. So what I'm going to do is just manually throw this on speed 10 and process it till it's about as smooth as a Vitamix can achieve. And we'll see how that compares. And now it's getting soft enough that I can pretty much pull the tamper out. And yeah, we're getting a good result there. We're just going to let it get to a minute. All right, so with a combined 1 minute 45 seconds and using the tamper, you can see we have a result that's pretty comparable to the backspin there. That is definitely a good looking finished peanut butter. Let's get these on a plate and do a taste test. Here's the backspin on my right side. Here's our Vitamix on our left side. And let's just spread, and then we'll take a close-up view here of our results. Okay, Vitamix, backspin. That feels and looks virtually the same. Taste test. Backspin. Basically perfect. Vitamix. Basically perfect. Okay, so we know we can achieve essentially perfect peanut butter on both machines. However, in this test, the Backspin absolutely delivered on the whole hands-free, set it and forget it promise. Therefore, it wins this round. It has a comparable result to the Vitamix. Both are basically perfect, but the Vitamix absolutely, positively needed that tamper and some extra time and plenty of babysitting. So this is a definitive victory for the Backspin in the nut butter test. Well done, Tribest. All right, everybody. The final recipe that we're gonna do for our shootout is the old Vitamix tortilla soup. If you've ever been to a Costco and seen a Vitamix demonstration, you've probably tried this. It's a simple recipe in the grand scheme of things, but it's a little bit more complicated than just, say, a smoothie with 3 or 4 ingredients. So I laid this out to show you what we're doing here. 2 cups of chicken stock, though straight water will work. This just makes for a little bit more flavor. You can use water and still get a good result though. That is about a tablespoon of a pre-diced mushroom blend that's pretty tasty. We've got a 1/4 cup of taco seasoning. You can add even more to your taste. 1/4 cup of Mexican blend cheese. About a 1/4 of an avocado also works well for replicating the creaminess that you can get from the cheese, depending on what you want to do. That is a cube of vegetable bouillon. We have a Roma tomato, just over 1 inch cross-section slice. We also have 1 inch slice of squash, 1 clove of garlic, 1 carrot, 1 full celery stick, and about a 1/4 to a 1/2 inch slice of onion. Get these ratios roughly in this range and you're gonna get a pretty passable result. Let's go ahead and get this loaded and we'll get blending. All right, so we're gonna start the soup test. On our Vitamix, we have a dedicated soups option, and this is one of the pre-programs on the Vitamix that works particularly well. A true set it and forget it in most cases. Generally, with this much liquid volume to start, we're probably not going to need to worry about the tamper. Certainly not going to need to give the Backspin any help, I would imagine, with a starting liquid volume of the same and its contra-rotating ability. The thing for the Tribest, for the Backspin to accomplish here, though, is temperature rise. We want to see, can this thing really cook a soup the way a Vitamix can? There are no heating elements in either of these machines. It is solely blade friction that generates heat over the course of a few minutes. And the first time you see it, you never forget it. It's a really impressive thing about high-power blenders. So this is going to be less of who made a better soup base in terms of blend quality. I'm expecting a good result on both sides here, but of course, we'll investigate. It's going to be a little bit more about, can this really get the temperature rise that I know that the Vitamix can? Before we get started though, one thing that we should do is take a starting temperature of that broth. Okay. For the Backspin, you might not be able to see this in camera, but I'll tell you what I'm seeing here. My broth is at 63 degrees. On the Vitamix, this broth is a little bit warmer at 65.3. All right, 63, 65. Okay, soups function for the Vitamix. The closest thing on the Backspin is auto high. Let's go. So the Vitamix had a whole minute 45 longer to blend than the backspin. And we're gonna see how that affected it, because we're playing by the machine's own rules here. Recommended settings is what we used for each of these. That feels cool to the touch. 84.2 degrees Fahrenheit. So that is a 21 degree temperature rise, roughly. And wow, look at that steam. We already know the story here. $146 degrees up from a starting temperature of 65. Okay, obviously no contest in the least there in terms of blending and heating a soup simultaneously. The Vitamix has absolutely squashed the backspin in this. But that's just one part of the test. Let's see how they did in terms of taste, texture, and give it the white plate test. Visually, they look relatively similar. Okay, white plate, backspin on the right, Vitamix on the left. It's pretty close. I think I'm seeing a slightly finer texture in the Vitamix, but less pronounced than when we did the smoothie. Of course, let's give it the real test. Let me taste these guys. Tastes good. A little bit of texture in there. And the Vitamix is hot. I'm thinking that's a little smoother out of the Vitamix. Let me try the backspin again. The Vitamix is definitely a little smoother. However, a little texture to a soup is not necessarily a bad thing. This is still very much a passing result for the backspin in terms of soup blending texture. But in the temperature department, it's no contest. That is one heck of a delta in heat. Now, we could cheat a little bit on the backspin by preheating our chicken stock, our water, whatever we use as the liquid base, or just by dumping this in a saucepan and warming it back up. Whoop-de-doo, right? Vitamix, you can even cheat and get slightly higher than it was able to get, though that is a pretty good serving temperature, but say you wanted to push like 170, 180 degrees, you could preheat a little bit in that, or run the soup cycle again. Theoretically, you could do it in the backspin twice, but just seeing the temperature rise we got out of one 4-minute cycle, you'd be hitting that button a lot, and still has yet to see what the ceiling would be for repeatedly doing that. I'm not going to spend an hour trying to chase the ceiling of temperature rise on the backspin, however. So if you have a backspin and you want to make soup, pre or post heat your soup. It's still a good blending result. If you want maximum fine blend performance, the Vitamix takes that, and of course, massively took it on the temperature rise. Both taste wonderful, however. So for the backspin, soup isn't exactly its strong suit, but it certainly shows up and competes. That is an acceptable soup. One other thing about the backspin, do you see in the jar there where a fair amount of the liquid got out of the inner jar and started leaking into the outer? Not that big of a deal. We didn't lose too much, but it is something to take note of about this machine. When you get a lot of thin liquid in there, such as a soup base like this recipe, past a certain level in the jar, you're going to lose a touch of that because the inner lid cannot seal very well because it needs to be able to rotate freely. So just one thing to keep in mind there. Also, with both of these machines, what we've essentially made here is a soup base. You know, alone, this would just be a hot broth, right? When you make something like a tortilla soup, which is what this recipe is, you could add in some tortilla chips, some black beans, some chunks of pre-cooked chicken, some corn, a bunch of mix-ins really, maybe even some black olives. It's going to be easier to do that on the Vitamix, and I'll tell you why. Because the pulse feature on the Vitamix lets you set a speed ahead of time using the dial, and then you tap pulse, and you'd only want to use like speed 1 with a few taps because it will very quickly stir that extra material in, and you don't want to absolutely pulverize it if you want your soup to have some texture to actually chew on. The backspin's going to struggle more with that because it doesn't really have a true manual feature. When you start holding that pulse button, it's going to start pulsing at full speed, and you have to very quickly try to rotate the knob back to speed 1 to slow it down. And one of my criticisms of the Backspin's user interface back toward the beginning of the video was that that knob has way too many steps in it and doesn't feel as intuitive as the Vitamix. So the fact that you can't preset your pulse speed means you're going to risk over processing your mix-in on the Backspin. It could still be done, but keep that in mind and feather that pulse button gently if that's what you want to do. All right, so we find ourselves here at the end of our test with the Backspin and the Vitamix, and it was a good test. The Backspin showed up and for the most part performed well. Here's just some closing thoughts that I have about everything. The good, the bad, some ideas and thoughts I have for improvement, and where I think it really does shine as well. What it's really good at is the hands-free thing mostly works. It's not perfect, but it's probably the best attempt at it that I've seen. I've worked for Vitamix, I've worked for Blendtec, I've had the chance to review this. There's a couple other high-power blenders along the way I've had the opportunity to use. Some of them have varying levels of hands-free claims, like Blendtec, for example, that also doesn't often need a tamper, but sometimes could have benefited from one. The contra-rotating design, though, is the best tamperless approach I have yet seen. So it absolutely deserves to be recognized for that. It's very innovative design too, and that's just fun. This blender is doing things that no other product has before, and that's really cool. This is also a vacuum blender, as Lee demonstrated, and we saw that that vacuum feature works. When we made that green smoothie, it came out with a noticeably richer color that kept for longer. So I think the vacuum blending thing is for real. And there are very few machines that have that feature. So that's an absolute standout. This thing obliterated the peanut butter test. That was hands down, no contest, a flying victory for the Backspin over the Vitamix. Nut butters in this machine are awesome. Frozen desserts are pretty good too. In our example, it didn't get quite perfect. It needed a little bit of help, but providing that and running it again, it did well. Now, I should mention, I did overload the machine a little bit. Turns out this requires about a pound maximum of frozen ingredients to process well. I did 1.5 pounds of strawberries, attempting to push it a little bit. And given that I went over, we need to give it some slack, because that was a little bit more than it was rated for. And it still didn't do that bad considering it. And I think doing a recipe at about 1 pound or less probably would have turned out just fine. As for the other recipes and just blending quality end results, most of them landed within, let's say, 20-ish% of the Vitamix capability to break down food. Generally, the Vitamix had a little bit of a better, finer result, a little smoother, so we should acknowledge that. But this was still completely within an acceptable range. There have been plenty of other products that have come along claiming to be Vitamix killers, and frankly, their end result sucks. And this was still an acceptable end result. With the green smoothie we saw on auto low, the less than minute blending cycle, there was a bit of a delta there, but once we ran it again on the longer cycle with a new fresh load, it definitely did a better job. And it got probably within 10% of the Vitamix that run, and I'd consider that good. Now, here's where I think the Backspin stumbles a little bit, and where I think some practical improvements could be made in a second iteration, or maybe even something like a Backspin XL, because I think a little bit of a larger sized unit could do super well. Anywho, the first thing I didn't really care for were the lack of manual controls, and where this knob is and how it functions. The placement's fine, but when in operation, it takes a few of those clicks to actually change the speed. It feels unintuitive, and I don't really love the feeling of this knob. A smoother knob or one with a solid 1 click for 1 step adjustment would just make more sense. Here's the other part that doesn't make any sense. That feels like a button, but it doesn't do anything at all. I don't really get that. The buttons for the automatic cycles, well, really there are only in the end automatic cycles that you can somewhat manually adjust the speed on. Again, no true manual. These buttons feel fine. They don't feel amazing, but they feel fine. So we'll leave that there. The other thing is this needs better heat management. This vent is not sufficient. I hit thermal cutout on this machine a few times using it off camera. I've only hit thermal cut on my Vitamix once within years, yes, years of use. Having thermal cut hit 2 or 3 times in the period of a week on this was a little annoying. Granted, that was with doing a bit of torture testing off camera as well, but I've done the same things to the Vitamix, and it's only ever happened once within years. So Tribest, better ventilation is something I'd like to see on a revision. Capacity-wise, 60 ounces is good. The Vitamix is 64 with its largest jar, so a 4-ounce difference isn't that huge. But due to the design of the contra rotating jar, it feels, if you will, like there's a little bit less usable space. And this has different load limits for different ingredients. The Vitamix is more black and white, cut and dry with load limitations. You can pretty much take it up almost, with just a few exceptions, to that 64-ounce line on the jar and just go with relative safety. You cannot do that on this machine. As we've seen, you need to read the manual and respect those load limits for different ingredients. Now, I get why. To make this design work, there had to be some kind of compromises. There is no such thing as a free lunch. So within a certain range, I do understand that. However, this is the first iteration. I'm sure further improvements could be made at least a little bit. The other thing is in regards to soups. With a design like this, maybe you just can't really make it work, but this had little to no heating capability on soups. The Vitamix had a almost 80 to 90 degree rise. This had like a 20 degree rise. That's comparably nothing. But at least the soup consistency was still good. Just a couple other quirks about this. It's hard to do add-ins like with the soup because when you hold the pause button, it's going to start at full speed and you've got these multiple steps that delay you in getting back to speed 1. You should just be able to set that to speed 1, feather the pause button, and get a good mix-in result. And that goes hand in hand with my criticism of a lack of a true manual mode. Another thing about this, and here's where Tribest could, I think, do something almost immediately. Let's pop this jar off. Let me show you what I'm talking about. Okay, I've mentioned this before. We've got the gaps in the jar, right? It makes pouring kind of weird. Sometimes it makes loading a little awkward where you're trying to not get ingredients inside this outer jar in between, right? Imagine a detachable lip that functions as a funnel that grabs each edge of these jars that's sized to match, makes a funnel for easy loading, and then on the end of it has a spout to assist with pouring. That, I feel, is a no-brainer accessory that would be easy to develop and implement, and Tribest could have that out before the year's end. So my friends at Tribest, and Will, I'm sure you'll be watching this, a funnel/spout removable attachment. I think that's doable and something I'm going to ask you to strongly consider. That would be an immediate upgrade, okay? Spout/funnel. Let's do it. With regard to those loading concerns and different loading amounts for different types of ingredients, the book mentions it, but we've got fill lines both in milliliters and in ounces on this machine. It wouldn't be too much more difficult to amend this jar with just little bits of text that say max liquids, max frozen, max dry. I think that you could fit that on here and just make it all the easier for people to refer to. So I'd consider something like that. Finally, just looking ahead to the future, if I was designing a Backspin 2 or like Backspin XL, here's what I would do, provided that a solution could be found, but I imagine that it could. I would design a unit that's slightly larger. I do love the small size of this machine in terms of footprint, but I think a larger size is somewhat necessitated so that we can do a few things. Slightly larger jar that helps deal with that feeling of lesser ingredient capacities because of those different limits. Maybe get this up to like 72 ounces, and then even just in raw numbers, say that you beat Vitamix. The other thing, a slightly larger design might allow for a larger motor, more like 2 horsepower, like the Vitamix. Now, it is worth noting, there are such things as power limits, especially on 120 volts in the United States. And this actually has 2 motors in it, the 900 watt blending motor, and then there is the contra-rotating jar motor and the vacuum motor. Actually, I guess that makes 3. The vacuum's not running while any of this is turning though, so there's no overlap there. You do have to overlap the contra-rotation motor with the blend motor, and I don't know what the wattage is on that. But most homes, modern homes in the United States now, this house was built in 1998, for example, are on 20 amp circuits. That's good for a little over 1900 watts, just following recommendations for, I think you want to be about 20% below complete capacity on a breaker. So if we could get away with 1900 watts, and I would assume that we could in 2025, I think you could get a 2 horsepower blend motor in here with whatever you need for the contra-rotating jar, and that would do a lot for this machine. It'd be easier to catch the Vitamix and final blend result. That little bit of extra power just might do it. Maybe there needs to be a tiny blade revision, but it otherwise seems fine to me. And I'd see probably a little bit less thermal cut and bogging in the areas that I did if that was also paired with a serious fan and ventilation on the motor that wasn't an afterthought. So here's the bottom line. Has the king been slain or dethroned? No. But he has been wounded, and there was a pretty good slugfest in which blows were traded. So here's what you should consider as the consumer looking at either of these machines. If maximum convenience was still getting a good result on most recipes is your priority, and you really appreciate, and frankly you should, the vacuum feature, which really does make a difference, this is your guy. If ultimate blend performance in every category, you don't mind using a tamper or babysitting or being involved with the whole process, you're not as concerned with set it and forget it, and then accessory ecosystem compatibility for doing more things beyond just blending, like food processing, or muddling and whisking with like the Vitamix air container, or dry grains processing that's more optimized. If you want that expanded ability, then the Vitamix is your machine. So again, convenience, good result, least babysitting, vacuum feature, in an innovative design, this is your guy. Complete performance that you don't mind being more involved in with that expanded ecosystem, you're a Vitamix customer. And that's about as fair as I think that I can put it. I'm still going to enjoy using this backspin though. I'm sure I'll turn to my Vitamix for some things, but in areas where I feel the backspin did perform, smoothies, nut butters, frozen desserts, I'll turn here. And I may often turn to the backspin more often on smoothies now, using the longer cycle because that vacuum feature is legit. I think this is a great first showing from Tribest for this concept, but I think that it also has room to grow. When you look at pricing, this is a $500 machine. The Vitamix Ascent series, I believe, starts at about $400 and goes up to about $700. The major differences between them are finish and mostly blending presets and programs. The performance result of all of them, provided you're using them properly, whether it's a more manual model or a more automatic model like the X5 with 10 different presets, the end results are going to be roughly the same if you know what you're doing. So, taking pricing into mind, you might be able to get into the Vitamix ecosystem for just a little bit cheaper, but you lose all these features. You might pay a little bit more and get 10 different pre-blending presets, all which work pretty well, but many will require the use of a tamper and a little bit more involvement from you. For $500 here, you get a machine that technically does have more features and does stand up in most tests, just not always perfectly. So in a nutshell, do I think this is worth it for $500? Mostly, yeah. I think $400 may have been a little bit more of a convincing price point, but $500's not bad. Not when the competition is directly in orbit around that. And if Tribest does a second revision of this, or just a Backspin 2, or a Backspin XL, etc., taking some of those things I talked about to heart and implementing them as this concept continues to grow over time could be a recipe for some very serious success. But it is a very good first showing, and I will say, well done, Tribest. This is not perfect, but it is good, and that deserves to be appreciated. All right, everybody, I hope you enjoyed this. It's definitely a departure from the norm for my channel, but I had a lot of fun with it, and going forward, this channel is going to be more about things that I just want to talk about, that I just enjoy. I will still do audio, despite some disillusionment I've had with it lately, and I'll talk more about that in a separate video. But I feel like I just want to do what I want to do. I hope this doesn't sound arrogant, but I feel like I've had a lot of experience in different fields and have learned a lot about a lot that I can comment on, and this was one of them. But hopefully this was useful to you, and maybe even a little fun departing from the norm and talking about something different but innovative. Be seeing you.